All right, so here we are. Warm greetings, everyone. We are here today to learn pro tips for starting an intentional community with longtime communitarian, Sky Blue. In case we haven't met virtually, my name is Lauren, and I will be your host for this session. So that said, if you run into any technical issues or otherwise need some support, please feel free to send me a private message in the chat. And if you're not familiar with Zoom, you can find the chat button at the very bottom of your Zoom screen, and that is pictured here. And I'd also like to note that if you would like to use the chat feature, you can send a message or your question to everyone here in the session, and that is the default setting, or you can send a private message to a particular participant. So if you'd like to message me privately about a tech issue, first you'll click the chat button, this little window will pop up, you'll click the down arrow here and then select my name from that list. But additionally, we welcome you to use this chat feature for general networking here today. And you can start right now by introducing yourself. So if you'd like, please click that chat button at the bottom of your screen and share the location where you're joining us from, what you hope to learn or get out of the session, and anything else that you'd like to share about yourself. And this is just a good opportunity for us to all get to know each other a little bit. Okay, so while you're doing that, I'd like to briefly let you know about an interactive online course we have coming up that I think will be of particular interest to all of you. Beginning on July 3rd is our brand new 6-week How to Start an Intentional Community course with multi-community co-founder and author Jana Ludwig. And during this 10-hour course, we'll learn the key traits of community founders, how to craft a solid vision statement, and get an understanding of the social dynamics and skills development for building a healthy culture. And we'll also learn how to choose and design decision-making, conflict resolution, and membership processes, and gather some key tips on recruitment. And lastly, we'll also talk about economic structures, financial sustainability, property search, legal considerations, and business planning basics. So all of the things. I will put a link in the chat here shortly for you to learn more and register. All right, so that is all I have for you. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to a friend of mine, Sky Blue. So Sky, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Always a pleasure to be in FIC space, sharing information. So good to be back. Yeah, so I want to start off by just very brief intro of myself. Just say I've been deeply embedded in the intentional communities movement as a communitarian, organizer, and consultant for over 25 years. And just to say a little bit about this particular presentation, this is going to be kind of a crash course. This is an hour and a half, and I'm just going to kind of blow through a lot of information. I will pause here and there for questions, and hopefully there'll be some time at the end for some questions. But this is designed mostly as just kind of like an info dump, and you will, of course, be getting the recording of this, and you will also be getting a fairly detailed notes document and the slides from the presentation. So all of that you'll be able to review on your own time, and especially not all of the slides are going to have all of the lists of things that I'm going to cover. So if you're like, oh wait, I missed that, it's like you'll get the information later. So just kind of let it soak in this session, in the live session. Please go ahead and if you have questions, you can hold on to them, or if you want to go ahead and put them in the chat as they come up, then when I pause for questions, we'll address them then. And again, just to give you sort of a sense of what this session is going to be about, this is not a step-by-step how-to for starting an intentional community. Go to Jana's course for that, or pick up her on-demand course, and of course her book Building Belonging for more of that sort of thing. What this is really kind of like, as the title says, it's more like tips, tricks, some ideas about different approaches, strategies, things to think about when on this journey of starting an intentional community. All right, so with that, I'm going to start the slides. Okay, so here we are, pro tips for starting an intentional community. So I've given this workshop once before, and what I like to say is that one of the main reasons that I'm qualified to give this presentation is that I have failed at this endeavor multiple times. But I am a firm believer in the idea that the only failure is the experience you don't learn from. And what's also true is that I have lived in 7 different communities over 25 years, and I visited over 140. And I always ask about founding stories. And I highly recommend as you're visiting different communities, ask about the founding stories. How did they get started? It's always fascinating to hear and very, very informative. And also in my work in the movement, I've talked to, I don't even know how many people who have also been trying to start communities about their experiences. So that's just a little bit about why I'm talking to you right now. And I would say that one of the key things that I've learned over the years is that you can do everything right and it can still fail. There's no magic recipe. There's no perfect blueprint. Every situation is different. Having all the pieces all fall in place all at the right time doesn't just take a lot of knowledge and hard work. It takes a certain amount of dumb luck. Um, Sometimes when I've listened to or when I reflect on the stories of successful communities, of the founding stories of successful communities, a lot of times it can sound like fate, like it was just sort of fated to happen. Of course, it kind of probably sounds like that in retrospect generally, but I think I don't think it is just fate, even if there is an aspect of that. Or you could say, I think there are ways that we can tempt fate. Or put more pragmatically, you could just say, I think that there are ways that we can increase our chances that it will work out. So I have been asked in the past, like if there's one piece of advice to give people who are trying to start a community, what would it be? And my answer to that quickly became, don't underestimate the task. So starting an intentional community is a monumental undertaking, takes a wide variety of skills, a strong desire to learn, particularly as much as you can from existing intentional communities. It takes a lot of emotional energy. On some level, this is about home and family. So there's going to be a lot that comes up for you that you're going to have to deal with. And it also takes a lot of time. Everyone in a group starting a community doesn't necessarily need to put in the same amount of time, but there is going to be some minimum amount of time that everyone will need to put in to make sure everyone's on the same page and everything is happening that needs to happen. How much time is going to vary depending on different factors. I'll touch on that a little bit more later. The other big key to success that I would say is do it as a group. So a key conundrum that people run into is how much to set down in advance. When you've only got maybe a couple people, a few people, how much do you try and work things out in advance so that people know what they're getting into versus leaving it open so that people feel like they have agency? So there's that question, but I think you want enough people to synthesize a vision that will be compelling to a wide variety of other people. And so, just one or two people are going to have a harder time synthesizing that vision that is going to be compelling to a broader diversity of people. But some of that work does need to happen because not everyone wants to be pioneers. So there is a degree of doing some of that upfront work for other people. I would say that from what I can tell, most long-term successful communities were started by groups of at least 5 or more. Um, I do think that if you want to create a compelling vision for a larger number of people, it's going to have to come from a synthesis of visions. And there is a degree to which I would say, like, if you can't reconcile your vision for a community with at least 4 other people, that might indicate that there's some rigidity or attachment or ego going on that isn't going to be conducive to community. I think even if you're only trying to create a small community, you're still going to have turnover. You still want it to be able to be attractive to new people. Um, I think there's also a question in here of whether or not the starting group can be too big. I think it can be. I tend to think that as a starting core group, 5 to 8 people is pretty good. You got a good synthesis. You got a good a good energy, like a good a group to have energy around. But it's not so big that because the relationship building aspect is very important in those early stages. But then scaling up from there. Okay, and then so the last of the top three keys to success are that personal and interpersonal growth are unavoidable. So intentional community is hard. It's worth it, but it's hard. We're trying to do something different from the mainstream, which we desperately want, but it's not how we were raised. It's not what we were used to. It's not what we were trained in. So there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to unlearn, and it just takes a tremendous amount of self-reflection and self-awareness to live well in community and to engage in the monumental task of starting a community. um, we have to be willing to work on ourselves, and take on the personal and interpersonal challenges that come up as a practice. Because again, like that's so much of where the good of community can come from is from that work. And you have to see that as worth it. If you don't see it as worth it, you're not going to have the motivation. The other sort of framing on this that I like is somebody said, we need a recovery program for people moving into community. Again, coming from mainstream, we have so much baggage, we have so much enculturation that is antithetical to community. So we all kind of need to go through a recovery program in order to deal with all of that stuff, so that we can actually live well in community and have some better chance at success at starting communities. Okay. Next thing that just want to, sort of throw out into the mix here, some key qualities and skills. So in terms of qualities that you want to kind of develop in yourself, that I think are key, again, both to starting communities, but living well in community. One, intentionality. It's in the name, intentional community. And I think again, this ties back to the personal growth side of things. Like it takes a certain level of self-awareness and ability to talk about things in a group to be able to be intentional about what it is that you're trying to do, and a willingness to be vulnerable and uncomfortable in that. Vision, well, I guess you're right. I have it on the slide here. Is commitment. So commitment, I think, is important, and there's an important distinction here between being committed and being attached. So you can be committed to something, but not attached to the particular way that it may look in the end, or the particular outcome. So, for example, you might be committed to helping to foster a regenerative local food network. There's lots of different ways that can look, and obviously it's going to look very different depending on where you are. Similarly, with starting an intentional community, there is, you might be committed to certain values, beliefs, practices. You might have particular things that you want to look like, but there still might be a fair bit of flexibility around how exactly it could look, how exactly it could play out. A lot of like it depends sort of things. So having that commitment, while also having a certain degree of flexibility and not being too attached to particular outcomes. Discernment, I think, is also really key here in terms of really being able to discern what is likely to work well, what isn't likely to work well, why things work well in some cases, but maybe not others, to think through things, and engage in that kind of process. Perspective, I would say, that's sort of shorthand. I think there's a particular aspect of living well in community that has to do with transcending your subjective perspective. And I would say also, I am an advocate for, there's a lot of times there's sort of a dichotomy that's presented in community of like, oh, we have to balance the individual and the group needs. I think looking at it that way is sort of like playing into the polarization of those things. And again, I think I really come from this perspective of like, I think we need to see individual and group needs as all being the same, that my needs are your needs are my needs, the group needs are my needs are the group needs. Like it's all part of a mix here. So really, again, kind of transcending that subjective perspective. I think a balance of idealism and pragmatism is super, super important. I think a good idea is only a good idea if it can actually be put into practice. um, a balance of effort and faith. Like you have to believe in what you're doing. You have to believe that it matters, that it's a good thing to do, and you got to put the effort in to back up that faith. And then I would say, if nothing else, good-natured flexibility and an attitude of service are the things that will serve you most well in both starting and living in community. In terms of skills, as I've already been kind of touching on, relational skills, emotional maturity, healthy boundaries, willingness to give and receive feedback, engaging in conflict resolution, vulnerability, being able to be vulnerable. Those are all really key. Organizing and organizational development, again, starting an intentional community is a monumental organizing project. So learning about how what organizing is, particularly from, in terms of community, or there's a lot to be learned from kind of more traditional community organizing that can really be applied to organizing an intentional community. And organizational development, the skills around being able to develop both the institutional structure and the systems and the relationships of an organization. Strategic planning, project management, marketing and communications, and financial management and legal management, the two most unsexy of the bunch, but in some respects, because of the world we live in, like it or not, are some of the most crucial skills to have in the mix there. Maybe I'll pause there real quick. I'm going to kind of get into a whole chunk of stuff around different strategies, but um, anything so far? Anything coming up? Any questions? Any comments um, on anything I've shared so far? Okay, doesn't need to be. Um, great. Well, I'm going to just kind of keep rocking along here. So, so there's a bunch of stuff here that I would generally just put under the heading of different strategies that you can approach things with, and kind of different frameworks for thinking about all of this stuff. So start off with what I know has been sort of identified by different people at different times as some of the key ingredients for starting communities. And I think I've even said that if you have at least a couple of these, if you have like two or three or even four of them, then like work like hell to get the last ones, because you're off to a good start. Um, in terms of people, I think about the people part of this in two ways. One is alignment and one is affinity. So the affinity side of it is, do you like each other? Do you enjoy spending time together? Now, again, this is different a little bit than actually living in community. When you live in community, especially if it's a larger community, you don't necessarily need to like each other. I think one of the things I had to learn at some point in community was like, yeah, we're not always going to like each other. Hopefully, we all respect each other, but like, we're not necessarily all going to be best friends. However, I would say in the forming of an intentional community, trying to start one, you're kind of getting married to each other. You are really thrown in together. You're going to be spending a lot of time with each other. So I think there is a degree to which you need to like each other and enjoy each other, to be able to keep yourself motivated in the process of starting a community. Um, on the other side, the alignment part. So alignment just basically means, do you want the same thing? Are you aligned around your vision for the kind of community you want to create, the values that you want it to be based on, different aspects of belief, et cetera, et cetera. So alignment and affinity, those are the two sort of metrics that I look at in terms of, do you have the right group of people together to start a community? In terms of place, um, the in this context, what I mean by this is an area or region, not like a specific piece of property, though specific piece of property is also obviously going to be very important. Um, but I think, if you want to have a sense of like of a fairly well-defined area or region that you want to start a community in, um, because it's if you're not all on the same page about that, it like I have seen many groups die because they couldn't agree on where they wanted to be. So if you can't agree on where you want to be, it's a good thing to figure out earlier in the process than later. And for some people, so some people are flexible, but others are definitely not. There are the like, I never want to live in snow people versus I never want to have to live in a place that's over 100 degrees. Things like that. Um, Place, money. Money, I would say, is one of the hardest things for most groups, in part just because of the world that we live in today. Capitalism has created a scarcity of resources for us, to try to do this sort of thing. So unless you're starting out with a bunch of money, or you have people in your group who are starting out with a bunch of money, this can be a real challenge. Um, Obviously, it does depend on what you're trying to do, and again, kind of the way you're approaching it. Particularly in sort of a phased, scaled sort of approach, which I'll touch on a little more later. But in most cases, I would say that starting and developing a community at this point in the world is probably a multi-million-dollar endeavor. And again, even like many millions of dollars, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. Maybe not much more than a million if you're trying to do something small. And again, you can scale it and that sort of thing. But yeah, but money is a big thing. I'll talk a little bit more later about financing strategies, different ways of thinking about that. Time, again, kind of touched on this before. There is some amount of time that is going to be needed to put in by everyone, and some maybe more so than others. But again, it depends. So some models for intentional community are much more established, particularly in terms of their legal and ownership structures, and which makes them easier to adapt. And they're more sort of out of the box, and like sort of your typical co-housing community is very much along this way. There are very lots of well-established designs, architectural designs for co-housing communities. Lots of good professional architects who know how to design co-housing communities. The legal structures, homeowners associations, that sort of thing that co-housing communities tend to use are very well established. Banks understand them, so there's a lot there that like, there are some models that are a little bit more out of the box than others. There's also, your group may already be very much on the same page about things, or already have very strong relationships. So there may or may not be a lot of work that you have to do to really establish those things. And again, kind of, it's not just about kind of figuring out systems and structures, how you're going to finance things, doing property searches, like there's all of that. And there's the cultivating your relationships. There's the building your culture. There's the developing the ability to give and receive feedback, making sure that you're practicing that, tackling hard stuff that comes up and not just sweeping it under the rug. Um, and then, all the ways that you need to support each other around everything else that life is going to throw at you along the way. And to enjoy each other and the process of this. I was part of a group, so I was struggling at some point, and I was talking to a friend about it, and she was like, "I think you all just need to go bowling together." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, we're not having enough fun." Like there was just that. So it's not just about having endless conversations, though sometimes you do just kind of need to have endless conversations, but it's also about sharing your lives together, um, and in a way that you are starting to establish the patterns of the kind of relationship and culture that you want to be creating in the community that you ultimately want to be creating. And then vision is, but mostly when I've heard this before, people, place, time, and money are the big ones that people include on this list. I throw vision in, and again, when I say vision, there's different ways that we think about vision. I don't mean the vision in terms of like the kind of world that you want to create, though like that's an important way of thinking about vision as well. In this context, I'm specifically thinking like, do you want the same thing? Again, it gets back to this alignment piece that I was talking about earlier. And I think what is true is that the devil is very much in the details. So and I think this is where it's really, 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 really important and helpful to visit lots of communities and to spend time learning, I'm sorry, living in communities before you start trying to create one, just to get a sense of how things work. um there's all sorts of things that groups run into that don't seem like big things in advance, but then when you run into it, they do seem very big. Like pets is a huge one, kids, obviously, aesthetics. There was I can't tell you how many fights have happened in community over what color to paint the walls. um there's also communication culture, level of intimacy, and potential differences around that. Like, are you on the same page about what you want there? If you're living in the same house, again, sort of like, there's the classic, like leaving dirty dishes in the sink, and like how are you similar levels of tidy? Can you agree on the temperature that you want the house to be? It's important, like, not to underestimate how important some of these small things can be, because again, we're talking about our homes, and maybe we're talking about the home that we hope will be our forever home. So this carries a lot of weight, a lot of emotional weight, and so again, a lot of stuff might come up even around very small things. And so it's important to take the time to really make sure that you are on the same page about things. um, I would say that there's a common conversation that people have in the process of starting a community, which is to talk about what your deal breakers are or what your non-negotiables are. And I think that's a really important thing to have. What I've also noticed is that sometimes you don't know until you're in it. Which is again one of the reasons to make sure you're doing a lot of visiting and living in community before you try to start one, because there's just a lot that you might not even be aware of about what's important to you. The other aspect of vision that I would say is, that I think is important, is around ideals versus priorities. So you may have had lots of great conversations about what you want, and and particularly in terms of what you're hoping to create, the values, the philosophy, everything you want it to look like. But when push comes to shove, and you run into a situation where you don't have enough time, you don't have enough money, you don't have enough resources, and you have to make compromises because you can't do everything, are your priorities aligned enough that you can find a way forward together? All right. So some basic approaches. So just kind of, if I'm just very sort of overgeneralizing, categorizing the different approaches for starting intentional community, I would say that there are three big ones. So the first one is build it and they will come. So I don't mean to be over dramatic here, but this movement is littered with the wreckage of individuals and couples who bought land and then couldn't understand why they weren't able to get anyone to join their community. Um, I think it's really important to look at your motivation in this, and that again gets back to the personal growth aspect of it. I can't tell you how many times I have heard people say, in that question of like, oh, do you want to join a community? Do you want to start one? People love to say, I want to start my own community, my own community. So often it's innocuous. Often it's just like it's a little turn of phrase. It's not. It doesn't mean anything. But often when people say that, I do get the sense that the person really does want a community that is the way they want it, which isn't necessarily going to be very conducive to community building. And again, I've seen there's just endless examples um, of this not going well. It can be if it's just one person or a couple who are starting the place and then people trying to come in, it can be really hard for new people to get past it being that person's thing, and to actually create a sense of investment and community engagement from a group of people and where the community really takes on a life of its own. In some cases, it can work. Like I'm not saying it never works. And again, this is where you need to be clear about, you need to look at your situation and what's going to make the most sense, excuse me, in your particular situation. Um, and again, I think, some models like the conventional co-housing model, where it really sometimes can be kicked off by just a couple people working with an architect and a developer to get the project fairly far down the road, and then people are able to just kind of buy in. Now, there are lots of co-housing communities out there that I'm aware of that have had to spend a lot of money on consultants to help them learn how to deal with conflict and actually build the relationships and be a community, because they didn't do that work up front. I think there is an important thing to remember here, which is that you have to build the community while you're building the community. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, it can work out that way. I'm not saying it can't. Similarly, I lived in a collective house of 8 people for a number of years that was started by one person who was the landlord and has been the landlord the whole time. And it was functional in large part because the arrangement was very clear. It was never going to be anything different than he owned the place, but he was kind of cultivating a collective household. And there was the he did a really good job of being very clear about what decisions he made as landlord and what decisions the house made, and was then also really good about not infringing on the latter. um but what's also true is that like a lot of the time that the house has been basically just a collection of roommates, like not really much community to speak of. Other times there is a group that comes in that really gels. Like when I was there, like we really worked on it, and we had a really awesome, really tight community for a few years. But so again, it worked to a degree. It also is like it was what it was. So again, it kind of depends on what you're going for. Um, the next big approach I would say is the group of friends approach. So I think a lot of people have a group of friends and they start talking and they're like, we should buy some land together. We should start a community together. Um, I think the big benefit from this approach is that you're starting out with a lot of affinity. If you've got people that you already are close friends with, that you get along with to a degree, um, that can really be supportive. There might also be a high level of known alignment on what you want, because you've spent lots of time hanging out and just kind of dreaming together. And this can like really help with motivation in terms of keeping it all going. Um, if you're not all already in the same place and committed to a certain area, again, you might still have to solve the place problem. Um, and as I was saying about vision, again, the devil is in the details. You don't know what you don't know. And a pitfall here is making assumptions that you're on the same page about things, and maybe even not being fully aware of things that are important to you, like I said, and then not doing the work to make sure that you are, until you run into something where you're not, and then it all blows up, which I've definitely seen happen. Um, Similarly, you can feel really close. You might feel really close to your group of friends, but on some level, it's easier to feel close with people when there's nothing at stake. But when you start putting your lives together, when you really have something that matters to you, that you're investing in, that starts having real tangible impact on your lives, and that makes you bump up against each other more, it's more likely that things are going to come up than if you're just, than you when your lives are not entwined in that way. And it will test your relationships. And if you don't cultivate that ability to address tensions and resolve conflicts, even amongst your really good friends, it can break relationships. The last of the three big approaches that I would say is start the vision. So here you don't necessarily have close friends that you're doing this with. Maybe you know some people, and maybe you have some sense that, like, oh, maybe we're aligned on something, but you're learning more from what it is that the vision of the community that you want, and trying to kind of form that to some degree, and then attract people to that as the potential, which has the potential benefit of starting off with a much higher level of alignment. Though, of course, there's also the affinity part to keep track of and be cultivating, and has to work as well. Um, the tricky part of the tricky part again with this is, if you're starting with the vision, again, there was the thing I said at the beginning around, like, do this as a group. So there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg here thing here. I think, part of the trickiness has to do with, again, kind of, I said this before, laying down something that is clear enough, that is detailed enough, that you're not saying that you're not pretending like you don't want something that is actually really important to you, and putting down something that, like, people can respond to, people can look at and say, oh yeah, I'm aligned with this, or I like this sounds good to me, while also being as open and flexible as you can about things that aren't as important to you, or and being clear about, like, well, this is really important to me, but I'm really flexible about this, and that sort of thing. So just giving some, information for others to sort of get a sense of, like, do we seem like we're on the same page about what we want, and then kind of growing from there. Again, it's this super tricky thing of like, if you're too vague, it's just going to sound super amorphous, and people aren't going to know what you're talking about, and are not going to be attracted. But if you're too detailed and rigid, if you make people read a 10-page document, before anything else, like, they might just be like, nah, that sounds like that's just kind of their thing. So finding that sort of sweet spot, and again, know that's going to be different in different situations. Again, these are all very broad categorizations. Any situation that you're in might be a blend of these different things, and is going to be unique. And the right approach, in your situation is going to be, what is right for that situation. So I'm again sort of just more offering this as a framework for thinking about the different kinds of things that go into it, the different ways you might approach it. And that sort of thing. As a personal example, in one of the last attempts I made around this sort of thing, I very much did started with a vision, kind of put something out, a group of people that mostly I did already know. So there was a basis of friendship, that was already there, came together to start talking about it. We definitely ran into the place problem. We were not, it wasn't clear that we all wanted to be in the same place. There were various other issues, but there were some things there. But in the course of that, I was like, okay, well, I sort of started with the people first. I was like, okay, I'm not going to worry about the place, and I'm going to try and be as open as possible about the vision. I'm going to be clear where I can, and let's bring a group of people together, and then develop it from there. I always had in the back of my head, it was like, well, if that doesn't work out, the approach that I might fall back to, which I haven't tried necessarily yet. Well, I did ages ago to some degree, was more starting with the place. So you could add that in the list of basic approaches here if you wanted, but it was basically the idea was just move to a place and make that your home, some town, some city, whatever. Get involved in whatever different kinds of things you want to get involved with, and find other people, build relationships with other people who also are rooted in that place and want to be in that place, and then just sort of more organically see if something starts to come together that you want to start something with. So again, lots of different ways of thinking about it. I'm not, there's no formula here. Like I said, this is just sort of different ways of thinking about it, and in terms of thinking through how you want to approach it, which is, sort of the more kind of general thing is have a strategy, like be thinking through how you want to approach this. Um, how what are you going to do? How is it going to lead to your vision? Are your actions aligned with the vision? You're not trying to just create a static thing here that will just all of a sudden pop into existence. It's always going to be a work in progress, even after you're on land. Things are always going to evolve. There will always be different phases of things. Again, this is an organizing project, and it's important to think about it that way. Another framework, a framework for thinking through your approach and your plan is, the classic who, what, where, when, how, why. Um, I think it's a super useful framework. Who are you creating a community with, or who are you trying to create a community for? What kind of community are you trying to create? Where do you want it to be? When, there's a timeline aspect here. Why? I think that this is the why of why you're doing it is something that is important to be really clear about. And then the how are you doing this? How are you going about creating a community? I think learning and using project management and planning tools, and skills can be really helpful here. Spreadsheets, Gantt charts. If you're not familiar with Gantt chart, GANTT, though it's a very classic project management tool that you can do more simply with a spreadsheet, but it just really helps you like line out the timeline and the different areas and of that you need to work on, and the different tasks, and what tasks are dependent on what other tasks, and that sort of thing. I would say that, in terms of timeline, having sketching out an overall timeline, I think can be really important. A useful trick with any kind of major project, in terms of planning it out, is you start at the end and then you work your way back. So say you want to be on land in 3 years. Well, to get there, where do you need to be in 2 years? Where do you need to be in 1 year? Where do you need to be in 6 months? Where do you need to be a month in order to have all of those things happen on that timeline? And then, of course, there's lots of great organizational and communication tools online these days: Google Docs, Slack, Trello, Airtable, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a million different things out there that can be super useful. Again, just finding the right ones that will suit your group and best support your group is the trick. Um, and again, thinking through different areas of development and the different phases that things will go through, and the different things that need to happen in different areas, in different phases, because there will be different needs at different phases. So, for example, the process, you might call it a membership process, or a classic thinking. The process you want to go through for new people joining when you're just a new group of 5 starting out, and you want to add a couple new people. That's going to be a very different process from, when you're further down the road, and maybe you are actually, have some financing in place and you're looking to buy land, and you want to bring more people into that stage of the process. You definitely might have a whole different kind of membership process for that. And again, once you're on land, your community is established, people want to move there, there might be a whole different kind of membership process that you want to have. They might all want to be based on some of the same things, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. But the actual form of those processes might be different, and you want to be able to evolve that over time. Again, for example, the kind of processes you want to have for clearing tensions and staying current with each other. What works well for a group of 5 might not be viable for a group of 15 or 25. So again, adapting and evolving over time, I think, is a really key thing to keep in mind with all this. One more little chunk here, and then I'll pause again and see if there's any questions. Financing strategies. I think there are kind of 3 big things to think about in terms of like, how are you actually going to generate the money to start a community. And again, there's different phases of this. Particularly, there might be a difference between the phase of buying land and the phase of developing housing. Now, most times, groups will buy land and there is some existing housing on the land, so they're not starting from scratch. But usually there needs to be some, at least remodeling, if not development of more housing. And so how you're financing the land purchase and how you're financing the development of housing or other infrastructure might be very connected, but they might also be very, very different. And then also how you're approaching financing is very connected to what ownership model you want to use. If you want to get much more kind of geeky about ownership models and economic models, I did a whole webinar on economic models for intentional communities that there'll be a link in the notes doc to that, the recording of that, that you can check out. So member generated as the first financing strategy. I would say within that there are some variations. But the basic idea is that all of the money to buy land to develop housing is coming from the members. And so then within that, either people are contributing an equal amount or they're contributing different amounts. If everyone's contributing an equal amount, that can be useful in terms of avoiding power imbalances. It can also create accessibility issues for some people who don't necessarily have a lot of money or any, but that you still might want it in the community. You can have members contributing different amounts, which can be more complicated, but it can also create the potential for power dynamics, but can be more accessible. Another thing to think about with in the member generated category is, there's often a certain amount of money that people have to put in then to be able to qualify for loans from banks or that sort of thing. So it's not like it has to be 100% member generated. It's sort of member generated and then potentially loans on top of that. There's also the use of bridge loans, which has been a successful tool for some people, which are usually friendly short-term loans. Like, usually and often it's a friend or family member will give you a short-term, maybe like a year of a certain chunk of money to bridge you to getting other financing. So for example, one community that I know of, a co-housing community, their people, they had some amount of money and they got friendly bridge loans from friends and family, and that allowed them to buy a piece of property which was a bare piece of land. But then they were able to use that piece of land as leverage to then get a development loan, which also helped them be able to pay back the people that they borrowed they'd gotten the bridge loans from. So getting creative around those sorts of things is part of that. Another big financing strategy I would say is philanthropic. So basically, this is the idea that rather than just we're just trying to create a nice place for people to live, we are trying to do something so awesome, have an impact, service, whatever, so awesome for the world that we're able to attract philanthropic funding. Maybe we're actually forming the community as a nonprofit, going after grants, that sort of thing. This is an incredibly challenging and high risk approach, because fundraising in the world of philanthropy is incredibly difficult to get into and to navigate successfully. It does have the potential benefit of having, again, sort of something that you're really aligned around in terms of beliefs and values and what you're doing as a community. That can be really beneficial. And just uh, having that approach sort of, kind of gives more of a sense that like you're really going to be your community is going to be really designed around your values and your mission in the world, because it has to be, because that's how you're going to get the funding. Entrepreneurial is the last strategy I have on here. So basically, starting businesses. I mean, I have heard it sort of suggested that maybe starting a business. I mean, again, depends the kind of community that you're trying to create. But starting a business first, and then using that as a way to then help build a community, is potentially one way that could work. Again, it can have a more sort of like, cohering, like bringing people together, sort of effect. And it's also tricky too. Businesses are successful businesses are about as hard to start as successful intentional communities. So yeah, it's not. There's definitely, again, there's risk here, but again, just sort of thinking through like what are the different ways that you can actually generate the money that you need to finance creating a community. Um, Again, these are very broad categorizations. Your situation is going to be probably unique. You're likely going to want a sort of a hybrid, or like a mix of different approaches. There might be, some amount member generated, but then you also want to have a nonprofit, and so you can get some amount of grant funding or that sort of thing in, for particular things you want to do. Again, so there's probably a mix there. And then there's probably also, in a lot of cases, what you're probably going to be looking at is scaling. So you might, again, if you're starting with a smaller group of people, you might want to think about the different phases that you want to be in, and that there might be a place where it's like, okay, well, let's have 5 of us go ahead and rent a house together and kind of have an incubator. And with the plan of then developing what we're trying to do, developing a base of resources to then be able to take the next step towards maybe something bigger. Okay, I'm gonna pause again and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, sir.
I warned you all that this was going to be a major info dump.
And I appreciate it. You're just a wealth of knowledge. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if anybody feels more comfortable just asking their question aloud or making a comment aloud, feel free to unmute and do that. We're a small enough group today. Maybe everybody's still taking it all in.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, I'm just gonna rock on and do the last kind of chunk of stuff here, and then we'll have a little time at the end, see if there's any reflections people want to have.
I, I, I just
Yeah.
thought I'd add that I wanted you to get some communication if you wanted it from the audience here. Really enjoying it. I know what it can be like if you don't hear back, but I'm really appreciating the information. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That is really nice to hear. All right. So I would say, so again, I talked kind of before about different areas that you need to think about as you're developing the community and the different phases over the timeline and that sort of thing. I would say, I think about community to some degree, again, both existing or established communities and starting community in these sort of 3 big areas. So purpose and vision, culture and relationship, and systems. So starting off with purpose and vision, again, this is both for like the community itself, but then this does also get into what is the purpose and vision for the community in the world? What is its role in the world? Um, and a lot, these questions really come down to this basic, like, what are you really going for? And what do you really want? So one thing I think about a lot with this is that intentional community, in some respects, it's easy to think about intentional community as a thing, but I think it's not a thing. I think primarily intentional community is an experience. So if you think about it as an experience, then the question is what kind of experience are you going for, and what is it that's going to create that experience? Um, in terms of what do you really want, I think it's very easy for us to think we want things, or to want things that are not actually things that we want in real life. Maybe we think we want something out of a sense of idealism, or because it's what we think we should want, um, or because we don't realize the implications of what's actually involved in creating it. So I think this is a place where it's important to get really honest and realistic with yourself about what it is that you really want. And again, I can't stress enough, like, learn. And obviously you're here now, so that's great. You have some inclination to that, but like, learning is so crucial. Visiting communities is so crucial. Again, living in community. Like, I had an opportunity to try and help be involved in helping start a community when I was 18 years old, and I did sort of like was peripherally involved with that for a while, and definitely learned a lot from what that group was doing. But I was also like, I need to live in community for a while first, and it was 10 years later, before, maybe more, 12 years later, before I first kind of really got involved in my first sort of direct effort with other people to try and start a community. Not that I'm saying you need to live in community for 12 years before you try and start one, but some amount of time is really useful. Again, there's just a lot of, like, you don't know what you don't know, until you live it and you find out. I think what's also true is that if visiting communities, again, why I say visit a lot of different communities, is that it's very easy to look at one community and to draw conclusions about things that work or don't work, or to kind of correlate or conflate or generalize based on a limited number of communities that you might have experience with. I've seen it over and over again. Just because something didn't work in one community doesn't mean it won't work in another community. Um, yeah, learn and visit and live in as many as you can. Um, and particularly in terms of purpose, I would say that um, part of my theory about intentional community is that it sort of has this dual purpose of being good places for people to live, and being vehicles for social transformation. um, and I have a whole thing about this that I shared in an open letter to the intentional communities movement. The link will be in the notes to that. I think those perspectives kind of need to be better integrated again, and with more of a focus on social transformation. Um, but on some level, you can put most communities on a spectrum of primarily being kind of residential focused, good places, nice places to live, to being mission driven, service oriented work in the world. On some level, wherever you want to be on that spectrum, great. Again, I think the most important part is being really clear about it, being really clear about what you want, being really clear about what you're going for, so that you're working with other people who also are clear, are like, yeah, that's what I want. What I will say in terms of purpose is that what I have seen is that communities that don't have a sense of purpose that is beyond themselves, that is greater than just their property line and their community, tend to suffer in the long run. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Another thing with purpose is just sort of, there's this question of like, what's the glue? Like, what's bringing people together? Gurus, charismatic leaders, as problematic as they tend to be, there's a reason why they have success. They can provide a level of cohesion and coherence of worldview, that people can really get behind, and create a lot of motivation for people to really invest themselves in something. Religious or spiritual traditions. I mean, from what I know, the religious intentional communities, the networks of religious intentional communities out there dwarf the secular intentional communities world. And it doesn't surprise me. It's like, yeah, they're all banding around this religion or spiritual tradition or whatever in a way that's going to be really motivating and just help make a lot of decisions and different things a lot easier. Short of that sort of thing, what is the kind of the ideology or the mission that's really guiding the community? Maybe more kind of practical rules, guidelines, principles. For example, Dancing Rabbit Eco Village laid down a really pretty what's the word I want to use? Not strict, but just uh, very intense set of ecological covenants. Um, and that really kind of helped self-select for the kind of people who were willing to come and be part of that community, and which then helped it develop in a very particular way. I mean, in a similar sense, when people are like, actually a couple people recently have reached out asking, expressing interest in trying to start a community focused on serving rescue animals. And I'm like, cool. Like, obviously, like if that's your passion, like getting together a group of people around that as their passion, like that's going to be, there's some glue there. Like that's going to be supportive. Having a vegan household, like only so many people like want to actually live in a vegan household. So if you're just like, well, I want a vegan household, like cool, start there. Like that's it's gonna narrow the pool potentially in a useful way, and give you something that you have some glue around. Again, kind of, what this is pointing to is stuff around culture and relationships as also the important glue. I'll talk a little bit more about culture and relationships in a second. Um, in terms of vision, again, this what does this actually look like? And I think in this there are a lot of key choice points that have important implications. So again, location, number of people. Number of people is huge. Less than 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 50, over 50, over 100, over 200. These different numbers of people have very different kinds of social dynamics. And so again, what is the kind of experience that you're going for? How much of an emphasis is there on common facilities? Is it really minimal, or is it more robust? What's your level of emphasis on community activities, community dinners, social activities, celebrations, that sort of thing? Expectations around labor and money contributions. Is it more minimal, or is it really high? Community endeavors, businesses, nonprofits, education, events, that sort of thing. The different kinds of housing options. Is it single family housing? Are there collective houses? Is it a mix? What the ownership model is, again, the financing strategy, and again, the systems and structures, culture and relationship stuff. Like all of these are just really important things that you do have to think through that are going to create a very different kind of experience for people. And what kind of experience are you wanting to create? The last piece I'll sort of say with this purpose and vision stuff is I just want to touch on foundational documents and statements, which can be very important ways of expressing in written words what your purpose and vision is. So because of the world we live in and the legal structures or legal entities that we need to have in order to hold title to land in particular, this is often expressed as legal bylaws or operating agreements. But while there are certain legal bases you have to cover in bylaws and operating agreements, there is also a good deal of flexibility that you can build into these documents in terms of how much your values and ideals influence how you write these documents and what you include in them. For example, one group I know of, they had what they called a narrative operating agreement. So they had all the different very kind of technical chunks that had to be there. But in the beginning of each section, they wrote out a more narrative thing about like what this meant to them as a community and what it meant in terms of the kind of culture and relationships, again, that part of it that they were particularly wanting to cultivate, and sort of the how they were intending, kind of the spirit behind those agreements, not just the technical particulars of what was in those agreements. You also have your typical mission and vision statements, other kinds of statements like values, goals, principles, covenants, codes of conduct. These can all be really important. I think the thing that I really like to point out, and again, this is definitely for established communities as well as forming communities, those kinds of documents, those kinds of written documents are only as valuable as the process that created them. So what I mean by that is that the words themselves will never capture all of the complexity and nuance of the different perspectives that people have on something. And so I can't tell you how many times this is so common. It's common in nonprofits, all types of groups. People will come up with some nice sounding vision and mission, but they have very different understandings of what it means. It doesn't have a lot of direct implication or clarity on what does that actually mean for the community and how things are being developed. And it just ends up being kind of words on a piece of paper that people don't really pay a lot of attention to, or people get into conflicts over. So that's what I say, the process of creating those statements, like that's where the importance is, really knowing that you're on the same page as much as humanly possible about things. And then having the statements come out of that process, I think is really important. And then the other important thing, again, for those kinds of statements, but also your sense of purpose and vision as a whole, is they need to be renewed. One person sort of likened it to renewing your vows in a marriage. I think communities need to renew their vows and renew their sense of purpose, and particularly not just let these kinds of documents just become stagnant words on a piece of paper that lose their meaning or relevance to what's actually happening over time. So then the culture and relationships piece of it, again, it all depends on what you want, and needing to be clear about that. What is culture? This is sort of a big question that tends to come up, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I would just say that culture is your collection of your group's shared values, beliefs, behaviors, ways of communicating, styles of self-expression, clothing, art, music, food, of course. Underlying all of that, your culture is the norms. It is what is considered normal and what isn't. And being intentional about culture means being able to be aware of how you are expressing it, being aware of it, not just being the air we breathe and the water we swim in, not just making assumptions, but being able to talk about it. Again, important tie-in to personal growth here, the ability to cultivate emotional maturity, self-awareness, to be able to have those conversations, which again can be very confronting or scary at times. And there's an important tie-in here with diversity and inclusion, because a big barrier to diversity and inclusion has to do with our inability to talk about these things, and to our inability to be intentional about what kind of cultures are expressed, what's welcomed, what's being cultivated. And then I would say again, shared experience is what creates culture. So really looking at what are the things that you're doing together that are beyond just having meetings or writing documents or whatever that's helping you create the culture. In terms of what kind of relationships do you want? Again, level of intimacy is really important. Are you trying to create more of a family feel, or just more of kind of a neighbor feel? And again, are you on the same page about that? Are you being clear about what you want, and is your group on the same page? How transparent do you want to be? How important is direct communication? How much do you want to expect people to engage in conflict resolution? Like, it can be very easy for groups to say like, oh yeah, these are all important to us. Like, we want these things, but it's a matter of degree. What might feel very transparent and intimate and direct to one person might not feel that way to another. And part of this has to do with culture and family background. Again, like what was normal for you when you were growing up. I definitely think in the process of starting a community, and again, for established communities too, people learning together about your communication styles, your attachment styles, your conflict styles, typology systems, like things like love languages, even astrology, Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, like whatever you're into, whatever, people can be like, oh yeah, sure, let's check that out. Let's all take that test together. What does it tell us about each other? It can be really helpful in navigating these questions about the kind of culture and relationships you're cultivating in your community. All right, and last but not least, systems. So what do I mean by systems? Sometimes this is sort of referred to as systems and structures. I would say that systems are organizational or institutional structures, a set of agreements, often known as policies, about how systems operate, and the processes for making different kinds of decisions. So structures, policies or agreements, and processes, like that all together is what I mean by a system. And in terms of what am I talking about? I would say that some of the big systems that you're of course going to need in for your communities. Ownership is obviously a big one. How is ownership handled in your community? Your governance system is a huge one. Shameless plug, I also did another webinar recently on cooperative governance in intentional communities. There'll also be a link to that webinar, the recording of that in the notes. So ownership, governance, membership systems are massively important, big systems that for communities, and economic systems, again, money, labor, how resources are managed, infrastructure, that sort of thing. And you can get into other things. There's communication systems, conflict resolution systems, lots of other things. But those are some of the big ones that you really need to be thinking about. And I would say that there really is no best system. At some point, another question I started getting asked a lot, it was like, what's the best labor system, or what's the best conflict resolution system, or what's the best decision making system? And again, my sort of stock answer to that very quickly became, it's the one that the whole group is on board with. Like that really fundamentally is the most important part of it. I think that there are some important other things that come into play around those systems. Like for example, I think transparency in governance and financial systems is super crucial. And sort of this gets into the other kind of big thing that I think about with systems, which is design principles. So people like to talk a lot about best practices, and to some extent, this is just semantics. But I like to think about this more about as design principles, in part because again, what is sort of considered a best practice in one community isn't necessarily a best practice in another community. I like to think of design principles that because to me that just kind of gets more at the core of what we want out of a system, and supports again adaptability and evolution over time. It's about saying whatever kind of system we have at whatever phase of development we're in, it should be based on these kinds of principles. I have a list of, I'm looking at the time here. I have a list of different kind of examples. I don't think I'm going to go too far into this, but again, I think with governance, you know, transparency and understandability on in your governance system, is an important design principle. Clarity on who's responsible for making what decisions, a clear path to being part of any decision-making body, clarity on how decision-making processes work. Those is sort of like design principles for whatever kind of governance system you want to create. Membership, you want to create a flexible membership structure that allows for people to come and go easily, and that also fosters the commitment and stability needed to maintain and develop the community. Again, just sort of like that is sort of an idea. I'm not saying that you should adopt that necessarily, but like as an idea for a fundamental design principle that can feed into a membership system that looks very different ways. Yeah. There again, there's a little bit more on economic stuff, but again, I've got other stuff out there, so I'm not going to get too far into that now. Um, I would say, lastly about this, again, I would say adaptability and evolution of systems is crucial, just as continual renewal of a sense of shared purpose is crucial, and the ongoing tending of culture and relationships is crucial. And these all intertwine with each other. What you're really looking for is having all of these things being in alignment and mutually supportive of each other. We've got one last little section on some common problems, and then we'll maybe have time for last couple comments and then some closing. So some major pitfalls: losing touch with your sense of purpose. So and falling into maintenance mode. This is a very common problem for especially larger, long-term established communities. And again, I mean, there's a lot of different things that could be said about this, but I do believe that maintenance mode is not a very inspiring context. And it also tends to actually be a slow degradation. Maintenance mode tends to mean you're doing 90% instead of 100%, and then at some point you start doing 90% of 90%, and then you start doing 90% of that 90%. And if there's not a clear sense that people have about why are we doing this, other than like it's a nice place to live, that can become a real problem for communities, and it is a big problem for a lot of communities. So that is a pitfall to avoid. Passive aggressive and then conflict avoidant behavior, particularly leading to entrenched unresolved conflict, and people using institutional structures to intermediate their relationships with each other. Again, these are very antithetical to communities, and really, and again, like we mostly come, like these are very strong qualities in mainstream American culture and what we bring in. So definitely important stuff to be aware of and that you have to work to address. Again, we come from a hyper individualistic culture, and so people will tend to focus on their individual lives, and there will tend to be a design towards individual lives, even if there is sort of a stated desire for more community activity. But then what ends up happening is that there just isn't enough capacity for collective endeavors, and then there can start to be this disjunct between what the community is saying it wants to be about, but where energy and resources are actually going, and that can create problems. Rigid systems, so groups getting rigid, and again, I keep sort of stressing adaptability and evolution. Getting rigid about agreements, getting rigid about systems, and then having a hard time being responsive to either unique situations or adapt to evolving circumstances. Or, there's a lot of like a very common, some people in a community would be like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Even if like it actually is broken, or it's broken for some people, but maybe not for others. And, who is getting to say what works and what doesn't. And, again, these kinds of problems can really come up. And then lastly, I would say that's supposed to say succession, not success. Succession and diversity. So succession in terms of a problem that that smaller groups or groups that have big buy-ins, which tend to have lower turnover, is aging population. So a lot of co-housing communities that have big buy-ins and have low turnover will often sort of evolve into what are affectionately referred to as naturally occurring retirement communities. And so, but and again, smaller groups, or ones where there's people are really invested, this can be a problem more, and this is a big problem for a lot of communities. And part of the problem is that whether it's age, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whatever it is, once you start to have a supermajority of people from a particular demographic, it is very, very hard to attract people from other demographics. So what are some of the remedies, kinds of remedies for this? Just having an awareness of all of this. So designing, with these different kinds of pitfalls in mind. Not that we want to focus too much on the problems and just, because we don't want to be reactionary to the problems, but we need to be realistic about the kinds of things that we're going to likely deal with, that are likely to come up. And can we write the DNA of the community so that we don't fall into those? Or if to some degree running into some of this stuff is probably inevitable, addressing issues before they become entrenched. I've definitely been in situations where I was like, oh my God, here I'm watching us create this problem that I know comes up in established communities in real time right now. Hold on, wait a minute, like catching ourselves is really important. Again, reevaluation, feedback, being able to address issues, being able to give each other feedback loops, in just information loops in community, like how are things going? The ability to reevaluate, on a organizational level, on a community level, is super crucial. And then I would say, in terms of like the diversity side of thing, what are the conditions that support diversity? One of the things I've been talking with groups a lot about lately is in some respects, diversity shouldn't necessarily be your goal. The conditions that would support diversity should be your goal. And there's a lot of things that we know are important around that. Again, transparency and understandability around governance, systems, financial accessibility, ability to resolve conflicts, ability to talk about issues, particularly power dynamics. There's a lot of these things that we know are these core things that are going to support diversity regardless of how diverse you are. And in that there's always more diversity at play in a group than is even being acknowledged. So again, how do you support the diversity that's there? And how do you create those conditions that will support, even greater diversity, which are just good to do, regardless of whether that diversity comes or not. So that is basically it. I mean, I think, again, in conclusion, community is hard. But that's because we're trying to do something different from the mainstream. We're trying to address the problems of mainstream society. So it is going to be challenging, but that's the point, and it's worth it. So that is what I got for you today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sky. I just learn so much from you every time. Every time I get to host one of these. So thank you for all of that, just super valuable information. I'd like to open up the time now for questions. We do have a good question from Michael that I'm hoping you can answer, Sky. What might you recommend as practical ways to find and connect with others with similar goals/vision?
Actually, this is like one of the hardest things. I mean, finding the money is so hard, and finding the people is so hard. I mean, again, there's all the tools out there. You can create a listing in the directory, in the communities directory on ic.org. There's a bunch of different intentional community related Facebook groups, out there. I think, again, it depends on whether, like, if you're already living in the area where you want to create a community, then, start thinking about, I mean, in some respects, it's like you start, use marketing, kind of marketing things, like where are the people going to be that are the kind of people that you're going to want to start a community with, and like go there. Like maybe that's social groups, maybe it's volunteering in places, maybe it's whatever, but like just kind of thinking through like what are the different kinds of places. I mean, again, stuff on ic.org, there's the forum, that there's some people there. Yeah, it's challenging. You would think it would be easier, to find people. So fortunately, I don't have a great answer for you other than, again, I do think part of it, like I was saying, is be really clear with yourself and as articulate as you can about what is really important to you and what you can be flexible on.
Thank you for that, Sky.
Yeah.
Anybody else sitting on anything or want to, even if you don't have a question, you want to make a comment, you're welcome to. Feel free to unmute if you'd like. We do have a comment in the chat that says, "Thank you so much. Very informative. Thanks so much, FIC and Sky." You're welcome. I'm glad you all could join us.
I have unmuted. I just wanted to say I'm in Nova Scotia, fairly rural Nova Scotia, and a year ago I put a poster up on Facebook community groups, but just all of the local little community groups in the area, with a really brief outline of what a co-housing community might be, because there are none here. Actually, there's one now, in all of the province. And I got over 100 replies.
Mm.
So I had a few public sessions just in a rental hall and kind of whittled down to 50. And then really by the time the engagement process had, gone through 2 or 3 meetings and virtual and in person, we settled out at around 35 people that actually paid a $50 membership to become a member of our group. And unfortunately, we found the perfect property before we coalesced as a group, before we'd done the community building work. So, and it was, because we were trying to do an affordable, relatively affordable component with ours, we were working with Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, looking for some financing through them. But we don't fit in any of their boxes for finance. So that became quite difficult. And we had to walk away from that property after everyone fell in love with it. So now we are regrouping and doing all of the things you just talked about, starting from scratch. But we have money now because we got some grant money to hire someone, a consultant, to facilitate our group process.
Yeah.
So I'm encouraged. This is all starting literally this month. A year later, we still have 35 people who are members and want to remain members. And we have 20 who are absolutely still with us 100%. So we just have to figure out how to do it. And that's our plan. So we're starting at the very beginning, all over again. But I feel good in that we have already done the mission visioning. We're going to do it all again and make sure that we're all still in agreement. And we learned so much from our failure. That there are all kinds of roads we won't even bother going down because we know where they lead. So failing, I don't consider it a failure. I consider it a learning experience. It was really valuable. We're behind a year, but it's been a wonderful experience, learning experience. So we won't make the same mistakes twice, I hope.
Yeah. You'll get to make other mistakes, and then you'll get to learn from those too.
I know it could get derailed at any point. We know that. But
and I think what you're saying is exactly right. It's like, you're unlikely to succeed in your first attempt, or maybe your first several attempts, but you just keep learning, and you're going through it together. And like, if you retain some of the same people and you try again, you're building those relationships. And it's like we got to just keep trying things. You just got to keep trying, because you don't know. You just don't know. Like I said in the beginning, like there's a certain amount of dumb luck that has to play into this. So, again, you were just like, what are we doing to increase our chances? I see another question. I also want to know one thing that you're reminding me of too is, I know some people have had, in terms of finding other people, there's been some success in trying to create more just sort of general interest groups. Like there was a group in there's a couple of different examples of groups that I know of where people were rather than being like, we're trying to start a community, we're just trying to get together people in an area who are interested in this, with the idea being that multiple groups could potentially go out of that, and finding ways to help sort people sort each other into groups, and then you're working from even a bigger network. So that's another thing that I think, yeah, I mean, and like you were saying, like getting 100 people, that's great, that's massively successful.
What we discovered that most people who came were attracted for the community aspect. A lot of people, when we presented the idea of can we do this more affordably, were attracted to that too, not necessarily the same people. And so, we saw that there was potential. You have to kind of pick your track and stay on it, though.
Yeah.
Can't please everybody. So we chose the track that we are on now. And,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
but of those 100 people, there could be a number of other communities built from their track.
Right. Yeah. I want to try, give some quick responses to the couple other things that come up. I think the question around number of people. So yeah, I think I think there's small group theory stuff out there that sort of suggests that you get beyond 10 people and you start having a harder time maintaining the same level of intimacy in groups. And so I think there is sometimes an impetus for people to start smaller groups, which I think is fine on some level. It has some limitations in terms of, particularly more on the economic side of things, like what you can actually do as a community if you're that small. I think the other thing to look at is subgrouping within larger communities. I mean, even on even bigger scales. I mean, like one of the biggest out there is the Eco Village at Ithaca, and they have 3 different neighborhoods totaling over 200 people. But each of the 3 neighborhoods has a certain level of autonomy. Earth Haven Eco Village similarly is organized as a bunch of different neighborhoods that are each organized as their own housing cooperative, and so each has a fair degree of flexibility in terms of how they develop and how they operate. But again, I think, in my opinion, I think 5 people is really, the minimum to create a community. Again, you could have, like, if it's just a few of you and you want to create a hub for a community, and you're sort of like the stewards of a house or a space that is a hub for a larger, more extended community. Awesome. That's great too. I think in terms of like actually having like something more like a dynamic of a collective dynamic, like 5 often just kind of feels like the minimum to me. And then again, there's different scales. Like I was connecting with a group for a while, and they were about like 16 people, and I was like, oh, it's actually like it's sort of an awkward. Like I was like they a little smaller, and they would have had an easier time like maintaining the relationships, but they weren't enough people to really effectively subgroup. And so they tended to just sort of like gravitate more around family units, but then the single people tended to get kind of left out. So again, it's just different dynamics. But I think 5 is a threshold. I would say around 10 is a threshold. I would say around 20 is another threshold, and then maybe 50 is another threshold. And again, the dynamics just tend to be around like how much more of a family feel is it, versus more of a again, they're the less, more of like a village, sort of feel, to put it very broadly. Yeah, and there was other question in there about I think around models for kind of networks of communities or multiple communities, and sort of the note of community land trust groups. Like, yeah, there's community land trust organizations, Northwest Community Land Trust. Also in the Pacific Northwest, there's the Evergreen Land Trust, which has a bunch of different communities that are a part of that. So yeah, I think there's definitely some models for that. I also think there's a whole really interesting thing around clusters of communities. So the Louisa County, Virginia cluster of communities, Twin Oaks, Acorn, Living Energy Farm, and then a number of other sort of small developing communities. all right there in the same location, and then a lot of ex-members from those communities who live in the area too. Like I think that, and so a lot of like mostly informal, but a lot of just relationships and exchange between those different communities. Similarly in Northeast Missouri, Dancing Rabbit, Sand Hill, Red Earth Farms, are all within a mile of each other. And there's a huge benefit. And Dancing Rabbit Eco Village specifically, I mean, they were looking for somewhere very rural, where there was cheap land and no building codes. But they also like specifically bought the land where they did because it was so close to Sandhill Farm. There was an existing established community, that they could build a relationship and learn from. And I've heard other people say that when they've looked at it, what seems like a clear metric for success for starting a community is there an existing established community nearby that cares about your success? Like that is huge.
David.
Great. Hi, thanks for offering this webinar.
Yeah.
Really informative. I've been fortunate to live in intentional community before, the Port Townsend Eco Village in Port Townsend, Washington. But it's been 10, 12 years, and I'm considering going back to intentional community, maybe even the Port Townsend Eco Village. So this is a wonderful way to get me thinking about it again in a deeper, richer way. And one particular question I have is around decision making and processes that will, how do I say it, not accommodate, but take into consideration, work with people who, for whatever reason, whether it's trauma, personality, challenges, just basic old being different, not derail decision making or subvert it, which there are myriad human ways to do, as you probably know.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing a lot about sociocracy, and I don't know if that is coming down the pike or working well, or what do you recommend?
So this is definitely a place where I say that like there is no perfect system. So sociocracy has its strengths and weaknesses. Other models have their strengths and weaknesses. None of them are going to prevent the kind of dynamics that you're talking about. There may be, tools or different things that you can build into to support addressing those things. And those can be very important, like having kind of regular, solid practices, agreements around conflict resolution, clearing tensions, that sort of thing. Yes, absolutely super important. And on some level, this is more of a relational and a cultural thing.
Yeah.
Like if that side of things aren't being cultivated, then the system isn't going to matter. The best system is still going to be sabotaged.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. But this is a huge area, and there's definitely a lot of again, this is not a place where I think no one has any easy answers for this question, but there are a lot of people who look at this a lot. I think a place to look, another kind of plugging Jana Ludwig, her work with Karen Gimnig, is the Cooperative Culture Handbook. That was published by the FIC. I would say that that's a great resource, and Karen Gimnig is also a wealth of information and resource around this sort of thing too.
I'm sorry, her name again?
Karen Gimnig.
Gimnig. Okay.
Yeah, and look up the Cooperative Culture Handbook. FIC sells it.
I'll do that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Sign off now myself. Oh, and yeah, thank you, Lauren.
Great, thank you. Do we have time for another question or comment, Sky?
Sure.
One from Angela. My experience is that we don't have tools as a culture to own our projections and use this as a means of personal and spiritual growth, something I'm passionate about.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's definitely, it was a conversation I was in with some people recently too, of just like, again, it's in some respects, if you're starting a community, you have the opportunity to really, again, I kind of was saying, like, like lay the DNA down from the get-go and really, kind of have those expectations, and really be, making sure that you're doing it with people who are doing that work and who are really like on the same page about playing that game, and you know, and are really willing to sort of hold some expectations around doing personal work, engaging in conflict resolution, you know, showing up for whatever different kinds of, you know, whether it's circling or Zeg forum or like, you know, whatever it is, you know, like that there's an expectation, like you're part of this community, like you show up for that. And then people coming in know that that's what the expectation is, and they're going to self-select into it. The challenge is, you know, I think in some respects more for established communities where that hasn't necessarily been the expectation. They start running into all these sorts of problems. And then some people are like, hey, we really need to have some higher expectations around this sort of thing. But then how do you actually bring that in when you've already maybe got a lot of people who are just like, nah, I'm not interested, or I don't want to do that, or, you know, whatever. So hard, you know, but how to, I mean, and it is interesting. Like, I do think that there is a degree to which, you know, I would say that you know, unresolved conflict is kind of epidemic in established communities, and it's a problem. And the lack of willingness amongst a critical mass of people in communities to really do the personal and interpersonal work is also kind of a big problem. I think really limits the potential of what communities can do. Again, I don't have a good answer for it. I just know it's a thing that we need to keep talking about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom today, Sky. So
Course.
grateful for that. And also grateful for all of you that could join us live. Thank you for engaging in this. I hope this was helpful for you. For those of you that are viewing the recording, sorry we missed you live, but hope this is helpful for you as well. So we'll close out here now, and I will wish you all a wonderful rest of your day and lots of success on your community journey.
Thanks,
Right,
everyone.
everyone.